The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the SafePaaS webinar series. Today we're going to be talking on the 3 pillars of modern transaction monitoring, and I would like to introduce our speaker today, Nigel King. Nigel?
Thank you very much indeed, Jane. If you could just roll to the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. So today's topic in this SafePaaS webinar series is the 3 pillars of modern transaction modern transaction monitoring. My name is Nigel King. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at SafePaaS. I have also been an employee of Oracle, looking after their functional architecture and security for their cloud applications, as well as a Chief Information Security Officer for Power School, a leading educational technology provider. Next slide, please. So we're going to just running through our agenda this morning, just running through the introductions, give you some historical perspective on transaction monitoring, running through how we started off this particular journey through sampling, looking at how that evolved into continuous controls monitoring, looking how that has evolved into machine learning, and how the monitoring rules now get expressed in both neural network structures as well as structured queries. Look at how we absorb findings and observations back into a learning model, looking at how we need to keep an eye on anomalies and outliers, and then we'll look a little bit into the future on where transaction monitoring is actually going, looking in particular at the advantages that those that provide audit as a service have in the data mining to actually find out patterns, as well as where we think the service is going in terms of audit optimization. And then we'll just sort of round out with the conclusions that we've found in this area of transaction monitoring. Next slide, please. So really, as an introduction to the whole topic, of course, transaction monitoring really has a meaning to any large technical audience, but it's really become a term of art within the area that SafePaaS operates, which is this governance, risk, and compliance area. So the members of this community really include data technologists and data scientists, as well as the professional community in the audit professions and the fraud examiner area. And in this expert system, those professionals have really been the experts in the expert system. So what we're hoping to explain in this webinar is how the technology has evolved from those early sample-based testing and assertion methodologies to where we are now, where substantive testing is really now possible at very low cost. We'll also explain how the human audit function is still necessary to supervise the learning machine. Even though we clearly have automated learning capabilities, it is still a supervised learning model, just to ensure that the events and conditions that are really unseen by the human initiator of the learning model don't blind it to conditions that emerge later on in its education. For those of us that actually live in this governance, risk, and compliance world, as we've turned on these systems for transaction monitoring, we know that we have to brace for the impact of large numbers of false positives that hit us. And that even when we have these systems tuned, there is still some background radiation of unseen patterns that allow us to keep our guard up against complexity of just leaving these systems completely alone. It allows us to ensure that we are constantly monitoring for these new patterns that might be emerging. And this really distills neatly into having an automated learning system, the model development that is really the initiators of the deep learning capability, and then the human audit function to make sure that even as this thing is working automatically, that we don't blind ourselves to anything that can that might be patterns that emerge late in the learning cycle. So these are the unlikely bedfellows in a modern transaction monitoring system. Next slide, please. So really what we wanted to do here was to just take you through some of the history that we have here, right the way from like double entry as the first of our internal controls, really to an expanding audit universe that now contains many things beyond the accounting system as part of our audit universe. Transaction monitoring has always really been the cornerstone of the audit process. it's been a way to infer some level of probability that a control is effective. And obviously the control of greatest significance for the longest time were the accounts with their own magical double entry controls capability. And confirming the validity of balances really allowed an auditor to express whether or not they represent a true and fair view of the financial affairs of the company. So this in turn really was a service to the investors to be able to judge the amounts, timing, and certainty of future cash flows. This is all sort of accounting 101 stuff. But we remind ourselves that it coincidentally has some capability to find fraud, but its the main thrust of what it was trying to do was to provide investors some idea of what the future cash flows were. Now we all realize that by the time an issue is really reflected into the books of account, any issue is by definition historical, and so any chance to correct it, we stand very little chance to correct any errors that we have found or to improve controls that we have found to be inadequate. And we also realize that in modern times we have obligations for constituencies well beyond investors. We need to look after employees, customers, vendors, and that we must have controls in place to protect their interests. And some of these requirements to protect their interests are now embodied in many pieces of legislation, not least of which is GDPR, which I presume is keeping the rest of everybody up at night. So we also realize that damage can be done to a company's reputation even if the internal controls over financial reporting are in fact effective. Examples might be, if you were a Wells Fargo customer over the last few years, you will have noticed that you suddenly had accounts that you didn't request, and that is, while it might have met financial targets for Wells Fargo, it's enormous reputational damage to have not controlled for that particular risk. So for all these reasons, the transactions that need to be monitored to confirm that the internal controls, both financial, informational security, and reputational, are all well designed and remain effective. Next slide, please. So to see where modern transaction monitoring is going, and to not leave valuable methodologies behind as we go, it is interesting to see its history and project into the future. This will really be our first piece of predictive analysis that we're doing here. Next slide, please, Jane. So to start off with, we're sort of talking through sampling. So within the auditor's toolkit, we've always had sampling as a way to predict with a known level of probability whether the hypothesis that a control is effective can be asserted. So verifying every transaction by human power is an expense that is rarely justifiable to the shareholders. That having been said, even in the sampling world, there's been some improvements with the ability to coordinate sample sizing with things like control frequency, and to coordinate samples with things like audit procedures and records requests and engagement letters. So in this way, samples can support the evaluation of many controls in the overall audit plan. With the early focus in this journey on accounts as being the sort of touchstone of internal controls, the hypothesis being tested was that every balance could be supported by an underlying transaction and that all the transactions get processed. But now the audit universe has expanded enormously. The hypotheses that we're now testing are things like, are all authorizations approved? Are all expense claims legitimate? Have all employees passed background checks? Is all the activity on the network legitimate? So we have a much expanded audit universe, even if we are looking at just purely sampling as our technique for verifying the assertions that we wish to make about internal controls. Next slide, please, Jane. So next in this journey is the movement to continuous controls monitoring. So with the need to increase the reliability of controls, coupled with the need to make control verification methodologies much more efficient, transaction monitoring has really moved into the realms of rules being applied on every transaction that is being evaluated. If we take the example of expense reports being legitimate, we may have rules that report where we've got numerous transactions that are just under authorization limit, or multiple employees with expenses to the same vendor on the same day, all ways that might be ways to override or get around our existing internal controls and expense policies. So being able to report these allows us to move from a sample-based approach to a substantive approach, and therefore having a much higher degree of confidence in the assertion that we wish to make about the effectiveness of those controls. This increase has really only been viable because of the ability to deploy specialist tools for continuous controls monitoring. But those tools can only be as good as the rules that they actually evaluate. Next slide, please, Jane. So that brings us to the area of machine learning. So here we've got like a number of inputs and levels of depth in a learning model to go from an input layer where we're looking at the attribute values of a given transaction or whatever the tracked object might be, through a number of different layers of association between those attributes to come out to an assertion that we can make at the end, like is this transaction legitimate or is it not legitimate? Next slide, please, Jane. To express these rules in sort of neural net as well as structured queries, I think we're all familiar with rules being expressed in a structured query language. One example might be that if you're looking at general ledger transactions, if you're looking at transactions that are releasing reserves very close to the reporting date, they might be subject to a much harsher review because they have the ability to arbitrarily move a profit number. So we can envisage a very simple select statement that might locate those transactions. So if they're very close to the reporting date and they're releasing reserves. Similarly, if we're seeing large outbound data volumes from the network, we should be suspicious of the activity, and we can see how we might select those from the log file. There can also be relationships between, you can express these as relationships between different attributes that may be strong with relationship to a particular outcome. So if we're looking at the outcome that is this transaction worthy of investigation, we can use our assessment of the current transaction as to whether they are worthy of investigating to strengthen or weaken those relationships. In the example about release of reserves, if we have a transaction against reserves that is within 3 days of reporting, we may flag that and investigate it and find that it was, yep, those are well worthy of subsequent investigation. If we're looking at things that are 5 days or older, we may look at them and find out that, well, they are not worthy of further investigation. So this is giving you an example of how you might strengthen or weaken relationships between different attributes of the tracked transaction. Of course, this requires considerable transformation and manipulation from the originating system. So you don't do this within the originating system, even though the end result you might well be able to express in terms of simple SQL, in terms of simple structured queries. Next slide, please, Jane. So next, we're really talking about how we're absorbing findings and observations back into those rules. So what we've gone through so far is really just a way of sort of gathering training data as we've created rules, and those rules are now off running of their own accord. But luckily within the audit field, that we have requirements to go back and test transactions on a regular basis just to confirm that the model is working correctly. So for ourselves in the audit field, this is what we normally do. This is absorbing findings and observations, back into the rules. As we gather findings and observations within our audit engagements, we will also be strengthening and weakening those relationships between the attributes that we found in those transactions. This will allow us to further refine the model as we just do the work of auditing. And as we evaluate transactions that have been flagged in this continuous controls monitoring capability, those results are plowed back into the model for strengthening or weakening the assumptions about relationships between those attributes. And once we've absorbed our findings and observations, the results of what attributes and their values are prima facie indicators of a problem can be expressed, if we wish, back into a structured query language that just means that they're more easily human readable. Next slide, please, Jane. Next we're really talking about finding the anomalies and outliers, because even in a well-tuned neural network model, we're still increasing and decreasing the relationships between features that we put into the model in the first place. We've gone through this transformation from the sort of relational, transactional world. We've moved it into a network of relationships between these attributes, but it's still those attributes that we thought of modeling in the first place. So it's still important to analyze the data for patterns and outliers that are not yet taken into consideration in the model. In the example that we talked through above with reserves being released, we may find that transactions from reserves are much more likely to happen on a particular day of the week because a supervisor is absent, something that we might not have thought of as something that we included in our original model. If we're looking at a different example, we may find that a purchasing transaction, purchasing transactions that are happening off contract are concentrated on a particular vendor, something that we might not have considered to put into our original neural network model. So we can use the normal auditing process just to find our outliers and just use standard statistical methods and sort of clusters and anomaly analysis to work these features back into the neural network model. Next slide, please, Jane. So next we might ask, so where is transaction monitoring going? So in trying to predict this, this is our first piece of predictive analysis that we're doing here. Next slide, please, if you could, Jane. So here we're really talking about audit as a service and mining for audit rules. So hopefully anomalous transactions are by definition rare, that if we've got fraudulent transactions, we really hope that if you're a successful business, that chasing down fraudulent transactions isn't occupying you a great deal of the time, that they are by definition rare. But the rate of learning on what constitutes a fraudulent transaction in terms of its attributes and the relationship between attributes is very dependent on having training data. So this training data is if we are successful companies, the training data should be rare. But SaaS companies, those that offer software as a service in the audit field, have access to this precious commodity of fraudulent transactions across all of their tenants. So this means that members of the service can actually share the spoils of the service in terms of the refinement of the rules if we do pool the fraudulent transactions as this rare and valuable commodity. It means that the service provider also has to be able to guarantee privacy in the use of this learning data. So it means that the extraction and the normalization capabilities must be very transparent so that all parties that are allowing their fraudulent transactions to be used in this way just to understand what the risks are and what the controls are in place for privacy controls on these transactions. Next slide, please, Jane. So next, talking about audit optimization. Given that in these three pillars of modern transaction monitoring, we sort of acknowledge that the human audit function is still very valuable as part of the supervised learning model. But it does mean that we've got to be able to utilize those scarce resources very well. So we need to develop an audit program that will focus our scarce audit resources on where they can provide most value within the organization. But we need to be able to express most value in terms of a proper objective function. So the objective function for this optimization is really to minimize the residual risk, to maximize the reliability, to maximize confidence in the assertion, and to minimize the costs subject to the constraints of having limited people and budgets that we can put into the audit function. So audit procedures confirm a set of controls if they can prove them to be effective, and therefore reduce the residual risk in a number of risks that have been identified in the risk assessment phase of the overall audit program. Now, we know the time and the costs that are associated with the execution of an audit procedure. So this allows us to rank them according to their risk removed. And we can also modify the time and cost for sample size in that we use to evaluate that control that will allow us to increase or decrease the confidence in the results once we have evaluated that sample. So in this way, we can optimize for both the risk removed and the confidence gained, subject to the cost and resource constraints. So this is a fairly straightforward, optimization problem that we have all of the parameters needed to optimize our audit functions according to this objective function. Over to the next slide, please, if we could, Jane. So this is really just bringing us to the conclusions. Hopefully, in having shared the journey that I've taken you through in this webinar, we all come to the same conclusions here, that a transaction monitoring solution is vital to protect the validity of financial reporting, the assets of the enterprise, information security, and the reputation of any organization. And that transaction monitoring is necessary to confirm the internal controls are designed well and are working effectively. So these are all kind of givens. And having adequate internal controls is mandated now under many regulations that now include the General Data Protection regulations. I think what we have hopefully demonstrated to you in this webinar is that a transaction monitoring solution should include a manual audit function, as well as continuous transaction monitoring, as well as a machine learning and audit optimization components. And really, there are specialist providers in the cloud that have an advantage in this area in the speed of learning that they get through the training data from many that they can get from many tenants. So hopefully you have shared the conclusions with me as I've taken you through this journey for the 3 pillars of modern transaction monitoring. So with that, I'm going to hand back over to Jane for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for that very insightful webinar. We do have a couple of questions that have been posed. So the first question is, does SafePaaS do this now?
Oh, I think that is a great question. We have many of the components. This is obviously where we are moving to. For those customers that are using our access pass components, for example, we certainly have mechanisms to track segregation of duties issues, and for those of us that have turned on segregation of duties issues, they'll know that there are many opportunities to throw up false positives here. So there are some patterns of false positives that we allow you to turn off automatically. So things where the user might have access to the function, but they can't. In theory, they have access to the function, but they have no mechanism to navigate to it. Those are some examples of refining the rules through back into the originating rules in our continuous transaction monitoring. And as you discover new false positives in the manual audit field, you'll also be refining those rules as well. So we have some components in here, and we're becoming more robust as we move out to a full audit automation capability.
Thank you, Nigel. And the second question, you mentioned pooling fraudulent transactions as learning data. What does SafePaaS do to guarantee the privacy of the data?
Oh, what an insightful question. Great question. So clearly those companies that participate in the overall pooling have to be confident that in giving away a transaction that they have found to be fraudulent, to be pooled amongst the others for the determination of what patterns we might find, need to be very confident. It's the same mechanism that we use in the rest of the rest of the transaction database, where we kind of know what is the personal data, and that we actually remove rather than mask the personal data as we pool it for the machine learning capabilities. That's how we do it, because we can extract the data into a sort of anonymous form. We don't leave it where it is. We actually extract it into an area where it no longer has any personally identifiable or private data associated to it.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Nigel. We don't have any other questions right now, so I'm going to end this webinar. The webinar will be available up on the SafePaaS website for you to review at a later date. It will be up in the next 24 hours. So thank you again for joining. And thank you, Nigel, for presenting to us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.